kind of touch base. It sounds like one area that would be useful to touch on is just sort of a bit about OHCS, how we fund homeless services as well as other support services out across the state, as you all are trying to think through this sort of massive question around these additional funds. So I am happy to dive in there, but I also want to kind of just make sure that assumption is correct, that that's a useful starting point. And before digging in too far, I want to make sure that that's useful for you all.
Mike, I'm going to ask you to pause for a sec. There's a kind of a method we go through in the beginning of these meetings to make sure that we're live on YouTube since it's a public meeting. So I'll do that quick spiel. So we're recording this meeting for purposes of sharing with members who can't attend. Remember that this is a public meeting and we will be live on YouTube, and the chat is subject to public record. If you have any connectivity issues, you can contact Brandy. You all have her contact info. So heads up to everyone that we will now be going live on YouTube. All right, thank you. With us is Mike, and Lakeisha, would you please introduce Mike again now that we're live for the public?
All right, I'm Keisha, one of your tribe chairs for Measure 110. And Mike is gonna be our speaker. He has to leave us soon, so we're going to dive right into his presentation. Mike Severa is from the Oregon Department of Housing and Community Services. And I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great to be with you all. And so I'll try to be brief and direct here for folks so we can dig in. So I'll just introduce myself again for the record. So my name is Mike Severa. I'm the Assistant Director of Homeless Services. My background is I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a certified addictions counselor. So I am definitely excited about the work you all are digging into. And I have, just really, really excited to talk through a bit more about how homeless services work here at the state of Oregon, and sort of how we have historically funded folks out across the state. So I've got a quick little PowerPoint I'll try to pull up here, and just bear with me. Can you all see the full screen version, or do I need to stop sharing, reshare?
Looks good to me. Thank you.
It's all good?
Yes, and Mike, I will monitor the chat. We have folks helping to monitor the chat, so we'll let you know if there are questions there. Okay.
Great. Okay, so just wanted to, apologies for we're reusing our PowerPoint presentation, so apologize for that. So just wanted to make sure folks are kind of aware. So OHCS is a state agency. We take federal, state, and local dollars, and we work with service partners to essentially stand up different services and resources. We are the state's housing finance agency, so we have a whole branch that just works on building and maintaining affordable housing. I work in the department that's really focused on the community services. So I'm going to kind of direct our time today about that. Our primary grantees here at OHCS Homeless Services are the community action agencies. So the community action agencies are a network of service providers and local units of local government across the state, as you can see here on this slide that shows essentially the regions that we fund. There's 18 different organizations, as well as the Oregon Human Development Corporation, which is a culturally specific organization that serves farm workers and the Latinx population across the state. So we have contracts with these organizations. Our statute that creates the system that we fund actually requires that we work solely with these organizations to fund them out across the state for homeless services. Many of these organizations have been doing this work for a long time. They're really embedded in their communities, and they often pass through dollars to other organizations beneath them. So a little bit more about continuums of care. Homeless services are really braided in with the federal systems for how we distribute funding. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level creates what's called continuums of care at the local level. Those continuums of care are established in a sense to create a system or a community of practice. And so essentially it's a community-wide approach to figuring out how we grapple with the problem of homelessness. They use similar software systems and essentially ensure that there's some cohesion between the different services folks are building. So it's a really important call out in terms of how dollars flow, is that you really want to think through this approach from a systems perspective, right? Just funding one organization or one agency could leave you with gaps where you don't have, for instance, an opportunity to go from shelter into permanent housing. And so this continuum of care approach is a way of making sure that a system has all of the parts that it needs. And so happy to go more into that. I'm going to skip this slide. Obviously, the data around the need in homelessness is quite apparent. I'll also just call out that the recent there's a lot of really good data that shows that homelessness is not a race neutral issue. It is something that deeply affects communities of color, deeply affects certain special populations at a disproportionate rate. Even here in Oregon, where the African American population is around 1% of the state, we see a 6% representation in our point in time count from 2019, demonstrating that there is indeed a serious level of systemic discrimination and systemic racism that can result in these disparate numbers of folks that are experiencing homelessness. We also know that our counts are often undercounts, that the actual experience of homelessness for folks across the state is not fully represented in the best available data, and that we have a lot of work to do to really understand the data components of these. So I've got some links here that can be helpful if you're wanting to dig more into sort of the demographics and the trends. We are working on creating a 2021 dashboard here soon that should be out in the next few months. The data is scant and different this year because of COVID, as many things are, but it's definitely an important process to make sure we have a good view of what's going on in terms of homelessness across the state. I want to skip through this one as well. I'm gonna stop talking there actually. So I wanted to, before too long, I wanted to just dig in and talk about, because I think one of the things that you all were really interested in hearing about was exactly how funding flows out from the state to serve different communities. So we have, I talked about it earlier, those community action agencies. Those are our primary grantees that serve each region of the state. There's 18 of them. Historically, what we have done is essentially had what we call the master grant agreement. It's an agreement that works, essentially covers a variety of fund sources for all the different funds that we operate. Because, right, we operate different federal sources, state sources. They are combined into one grant agreement and then essentially distributed out to those organizations by a formula. We use a variety of data sources to help inform the formula that we use to essentially say, what is the level of need in this area? We look at population, we look at demographics, we look at trends around those point in time count numbers to really understand their overall need. And then we use that formula to establish like a baseline for funding for each program. Recently, we have been working on opportunities to think through how we expand our scope. So for instance, how do we make sure that we're working with culturally specific organizations that are out across the state doing amazing work, but have not had direct access to state funds in the past? A really good example of this is that last year we received something like $59 million of CARES Act dollars for homeless services for the Emergency Solutions Grant. We went to the legislature and sought a permission to be able to fund out through a competitive process, essentially bringing those resources to bear on different communities across the state through a competitive process. We ended up funding over 36 unique organizations, 29 of whom we had never worked with before. We're working on getting those grant agreements out right now, and essentially we're going to be working with this new batch of grantees to help equip folks around homeless services across the state. We have a lot of lessons to learn from that process. I think a huge part of it is really like, how do we build in, if we're bringing resources out, we really need to think through how we support organizations to successfully use those resources. Just getting dollars out and getting them out quickly doesn't necessarily mean that we're also incorporating best practices, that we're also incorporating things like technical assistance and support for those organizations to really do their best job and to really think through how they navigate, the complexity of delivering $1 million grant or a $3 million grant. So it's really important, I think, for us. One big lesson we thought through is like, as we expand and work with new grantees and think through the strategies that we want to employ, how do we support those organizations with all the things they need? Do they need a fiscal technical assistance training? Do they need training on trauma-informed care or anti-racist practice? Like building in those pieces to make sure that the grantees are fully equipped with what they need and really listening to them in terms of what their pain points are, where they need support. I do want to leave some time for discussion, and I do see some chat questions rolling in. So I'm happy to kind of keep digging into some of these pieces, but I also want to see if there's any questions or things that would be really useful to talk through. Anything just like off the top from what I've said so far that would be useful to talk through at this point?
Well, just this is Ron Williams. I'm one of the tri-chairs, and thank you for coming, Mike. And just kind of as a point of kind of focus for us is that I'm sure you're aware there's a Recovery Services Fund, and that fund is going to be at our disposal to grant contracts and grants to create and make contracts and grants to providers. We're specifically focused on, emergency housing, transitional housing, supportive housing, recovery housing for folks who are engaged in SUD services or harm reduction services. So that's kind of our focus in terms of thinking about what are the mechanisms that we should be looking for in our applicants in terms of how they're going to get the services paid for that they provide. So the funding is available. We need to know what are the different types of ways that folks are going to need to utilize that money. Is it vouchers? Is it grants, rent assistance, site-based, that sort of thing.
That's thank you for teeing that up and super helpful context. I think I mentioned this to some of you, but I used to work at Central City Concern before I worked at the state. So definitely know how important it is to think through those variety of interventions, right? Like recovery support services in a large scale, apartment building doesn't work for everyone. Doesn't solve that problem for everyone. Harm reduction services are such an important, critical element for some folks. And for other folks, it's not the intervention they need in that moment, and that can shift and change. So that is such a good question. I'm so happy that you all are wrestling with that. I guess I would say, just kind of stepping back and thinking through like that landscape. If you're getting applications where people are really saying like, here's where our community is, here's what we need. One thing I've noticed just in our time, trying to think through different resources is that the way an intervention looks in one part of the state is not the same way that intervention is going to work in another part. So, a really good example is I was on the phone with a provider from Central Oregon today talking about what rural outreach meant for them. They're looking at trying to outreach to communities who were impacted by COVID and support them with different services. And the sort of usual strategies of email or Facebook or even going to the newspaper in some regions of the state just aren't as effective at reaching those populations. I think also just really being able to think through and rely on the expertise of the providers that are coming to say, here's where the gaps are and here's where we really need to think through in our community. I think a big part of this is just the lack of affordable housing. That is a huge driver for homelessness, right? And for folks that are right on the precipice of maybe needing support services or needing extra needs to make sure that they're able to stay housed, to stay on track with their recovery, and really thinking through like, how you pair resources, because my understanding from the Measure 110 funding is they're incredibly flexible in some ways. And so using that flexibility to be realistic about what each community is facing. A really good example recently is, as you know, from last September, much of their state was impacted by wildfires. And the sort of shock to that system because of all of those lost units, because of all of those lost lives, we're really thinking through how we navigate the change in the housing market, right, because of that. So a good example is we've been thinking through more ways of delivering vouchers for folks to get maybe 24 months or 36 months of rental assistance, even at the fair market prices, because we know that because of the wildfire and because of the housing crisis that we face across the state, rent prices are astronomical in some areas. So you have to be realistic with the realities of the market, even if it's a more expensive intervention than you would in some cases. There are complex sort of algorithms to determine what a fair market rent is. So I think being realistic, especially with the flexibility that you all have available, is a really good strategy to think through, or a philosophy, I guess, is a better way of saying it. Because those needs, like if you wanted to, for instance, issue a voucher for folks that are early on in recovery, and you're trying to figure out support services for them and getting peer support mentors for them to build out their recovery network, but you need somewhere to be stable and housed. Those vouchers need to be, you actually have to be able to use the vouchers in order for them to be effective. And so being able to think through what elements are going to support that person, even down to things like incentives for landlords to participate. Landlords often have their choice of candidates these days with so few units and so many applicants for housing. So really thinking through like how do you build or design a program that would allow a tenant who's early in recovery or who's trying to figure out, transitioning from maybe a long-term residential facility into something else. How do you make that transition work? I also think that other strategies you could employ would be like master leasing certain properties, or master leasing buildings or units to make sure that folks are having an easy pathway. Because one of the things that I've seen over and over again with recovery systems is that the front door of the recovery system is often the barrier we focus on. Like, how do I get access quickly into detox or access quickly into recovery? But the actual problem is the back door, going out of the recovery system and into the community. The most challenging part for the folks that are actually trying to figure out where do I go next is those backdoor locations. So, hey, we have a unit ready to go. It's furnished. All you need is the keys and sign this form, and then we're ready to go. We're going to actually drive you from the recovery center right into this unit. The only way you could make that happen is if you start to master lease units or have access directly to those units. So I think there's really good evidence that if you focus your energy on those transition periods between the systems, that's where I think you're going to have a lot of I guess bang for your buck to make sure that those systems are catching folks as they transition. Because often I see the barriers there as folks falling through the cracks in a sense and not being able to succeed, really because the system has failed them and not given them the opportunities to succeed and thrive. So I know that was kind of all over the place, but I definitely think you have an opportunity to think through and listen to those communities about where they need to those unique interventions that other systems just don't offer and other resources just aren't available for them.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, you were saying that long-term, when they get to the back door of the recovery services and they go out, you're specifically, is that permanent housing? Is that how you're characterizing that?
I think I've seen both work quite well. I would say we often think about the housing first approach in homeless services, which is really rapidly getting someone into permanent housing with the rights as a tenant, regardless of their recovery status. And I don't think housing first as a philosophy is actually in conflict with a recovery system approach. You could rapidly get someone access to an apartment and a permanent apartment and supports to make that a reality. Even if there are sort of hills and valleys of the recovery journey, it doesn't necessarily mean that the housing intervention was for naught. So I think it's really effective to be able to get folks, direct access into housing. It gives people a sense of ownership over their space that I think sometimes transitional options do not. So I think there is a lot of advantage of just sort of giving someone the opportunity like that, where they're getting direct access into permanent housing. But there are ways where you can also structure where an organization can essentially act as the landlord in that scenario. They're the landlord, maybe renting from another property, or maybe they own I think about Oxford Houses as a model to really think through, how do we scale that intervention up and maybe build in some more controls? Because I think Oxford is a great model to really build off of and think through how we get folks access to community, access to resources and supports. And we want to make sure that like all of those supports are available for someone, and that we're not creating a system that's only working for some folks but isn't working for everyone. So I think there's ways of trying to build in sort of permanent options that build in the realities of like the market that we're trying to face too. I think Blue has her hand up too.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and I don't know that I'm going to ask it in the right way, but I was just curious if there are any sort of types of housing that you're unable to fund, or any gaps that you might know of that we could just be mindful of with the next round of funding to make sure that we try to fill in gaps if they do exist?
It's a great question. I mean, I would say primarily we at OHCS are not funding a ton of recovery support services, so a ton of recovery housing. Really, there is no central body that's funding or even overseeing or providing accountability for how recovery services work in the state. And I think that is a huge gap. I think those types of interventions can be really, really helpful. I was talking with Eric Martin from MACBO the other day, and we had this great conversation about how we really need to build out, in a sense, an accountability or a structure for what we define as recovery support services or recovery housing. There's recovery housing that works for some folks, or that's designed in a certain way, and then there's recovery housing that works for most folks. So I think trying to build in a measure of here's the bucket, here's the barrier, the boundaries around what we mean when we say recovery housing, and help to define, sort of elucidate that idea is really helpful. I would also say that while we are often funding shelter services at the state, one thing that not everyone knows is that we're one of the most unsheltered states in the country. So per capita, the number of people experiencing homelessness unsheltered, we are one of the highest rates there. So really thinking through how, not necessarily funding shelter systems, but how do you kind of braid in the idea that folks who are often in early recovery or who need engagement from a peer recovery mentor could build into those systems. So like a good example would be, our peer mentors or our peer support services available in different systems. Like I always think of peers as being able to sort of permeate across different systems that others are not able to go. They're able to go into the medical system. They're able to go into the shelter systems, into the housing systems. That is an asset that I think wanting to make sure you're investing in those sorts of traditional health worker models is really an important one, that we just don't see a lot of those types of interventions in other areas. I think another area, just thinking through kind of harm reduction services, is actually like this blend of like street outreach and harm reduction services. We don't have a ton of I would say, well-funded or robust interventions in the state around how we go out and engage folks in recovery services out on the street in a way that's going to be adaptable to where they're at. So I'm thinking about, you know, in Portland we have the PPOP. They do amazing outreach work. They're harm reduction focused, so they're going and building these relationships with folks who are actively using and supporting the things that they need. That's an intervention that we're not necessarily investing in a way that would allow for folks to start to enter the system in a way that makes sense for them. I also think building in those types of interventions that are really informed by specific cultures, and knowing that like those culturally specific services and the interventions that every unique person needs can be a really useful add-on to make sure that there's opportunities for everyone in the system to try to get into it. I think sometimes, like if you imagine like a big bubble or something around the resources and services, unless you have ways to permeate that bubble and get folks in, or go out to them even better and bring them into the system, we're not going to get that traction with folks who are just on the margins or are not in relationship. So I think that's a really important design feature that we don't really have a good funding mechanism right now to think through those types of things, or cahoots in Eugene is a good example. There's talk about trying to build out emergency response services that go out to folks who are maybe in some kind of a crisis. Oftentimes, substance use is a component in those interventions and those needs. So it's something to think about as you're kind of seeing more ways of getting into the system. So housing and support services are really great, but all of those systems aren't as effective unless you're going out specifically to communities and trying to build those relationships and trust, and try to facilitate those connections.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? I'll check the chat again really quick.
Well, Eowyn, would you like to share your point from the chat? I see Eowyn's off mute, but I don't hear anything. Okay, any other questions or comments for Mike?
I'll just say I clearly love this topic, so I would love an opportunity to come back if it's useful and dig in more. And I know we've got a few other presenters, and I've got a 2 o'clock webinar I've got to run to, but I really enjoy chatting with you all. Please don't be strangers. Happy to come back in the future, and thank you all for digging into this amazing work. I mean, it can be really transformational for so many folks, the work you're doing and already have done. So I don't know if there's any other questions. If not, I'm happy to pass it along.
Thank you, Mike. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Hey, real fast, was there something in the chat, Roberta, from Eowyn that you might want to read that can be answered?
Sure, I can share it. I can share it. Eowyn said, I love the emphasis on grantee support. It would be great if we could include this sort of service in our funding.
Yeah, and just really quick on that, one strategy that actually OHA, we have been talking with the OHA public health team. They had an awesome work around the CARES Act dollars last year, and they brought on, I think, over 200 community-based organizations. Some of you probably are maybe working with those funds. They're amazing. Dolly and that team is just on fire. One of the things they did that I really appreciated and that we're trying to model is they brought on the Nonprofit Association of Oregon as a technical assistance provider around how to navigate like funding. So they had federal dollars that came with all these crazy restrictions and things like that. But even with state dollars, there are things that organizations need to be ready for. They need to have, cost allocation policies. They need to have HR policies. Nonprofit Association of Oregon did an amazing job of training folks and equipping them and doing TA every week for, it's almost been a year. And so just another element to think through as you onboard grantees, it's really good to try to build in that system of support for folks. So if they have questions about, hey, is this the right is this an eligible cost? Can I do this? Is this allowed? They have a TA expert they can go to and get that support. So great opportunity there if you want to engage that public health team more. They're stellar and on fire.
All right, thank you.
And we'll
Thanks
definitely
all so much.
Thank you.
definitely have you back.
Awesome. Yeah, let's do it. See you soon.
All right, Keisha.
Yeah, so a question I had, first of all, do we have any updates? No updates. 755 passed the Senate, now it's going to the House. That's an update. But a question I have for the group, as we have had these presentations on housing, is there anything that we're still missing or more information we need on when we move on to the rules making process to put into the RF GPs or whatever? I'm just wondering if there's any more information or anybody else we need to bring back so everybody is well educated on housing. Or do you feel like we have enough information to move into the rules making process with the housing element?
Keisha, I see a couple of hands up. We'll go to Chair Kennedy and then Blue.
Okay, I can't see any hands. All right.
I got it.
Thank you. I was really thinking about and really enjoyed the presentation. And still, the question in my mind is for really rural. We don't, there's very small population, but how do you, we would need multiple different approaches. And so it seems like that's still a gap because I haven't heard anyone really talk about these really small populations. So anyhow, it's just a question that that I was thinking about and trying to think, well, how would we go about doing this? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Kennedy. Blue?
I think this kind of applies not just to housing, but to a lot of, or really all of the services that we're funding. But for individuals that are LGBTQ plus, and especially if folks are transgender or gender nonconforming, I think I don't know if we necessarily need a presentation on it, maybe some just discussion among council members, but ways that we can make sure that those folks that are marginalized are included and that people who are being funded just the same way that we sort of talk about culturally appropriate services and working with people of color and making sure that, some of the employees look like the people they're serving. I think we might need to just look over our language and make sure that we're also inclusive around the LGBTQ plus community, and that I think I submitted some revisions to the RFGP that asked about like housing for transgender or gender nonconforming individuals, but it might just be something that we discuss or keep in mind as we are working on those rules so that it doesn't get lost and that those folks are included as well.
So real quick for you, Blue, as you're separating the LGBTQIA populations, do you think we need to have folks come in who identify as a person of color and LGBTQIA and how that looks in services for them, or just, I don't know.
I know Dharma, I don't think Dharma's in the meeting today. I know Dharma has shared some things in the past, but I definitely would not be opposed to having some other people come in and talk about their experiences. I think among some of the council members, we've either experienced or have some family members that have experienced some discrimination, but I'm kind of open on that depending on what others think is needed. I definitely just think that we need to keep that at the forefront when we are discussing some of the rulemaking and the guidelines in the next round of funding. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because with LGBTQIA plus still comes race plays a big factor in the way they're treated regardless. And I have some organizations in mind too, along with Dharma, that are like Black and Beyond the Binary, and some different organizations who are trans organizations and folks of color. So it's still intersection, but yeah.
That would be
Not
great.
exclusive, but inclusive.
Yeah, and definitely there's, in rural areas, a lot of times it's even more challenging. Yeah, thank you.
If you have some in mind, send us an email, some organizations.
Keisha, we have two folks, Ron and Sabrina. Ron, go ahead.
I'm going to defer to Sabrina, because I was just going to mention that Sabrina had an extensive conversation with Dharma about intersectionality presentation to the council. But so I'm going to defer that part. But just in terms of housing, just in terms of like vouchers and master leasing and organizational leasing and ownership, I think, I would hope, I think that more technical information would be needed, and it would be helpful to have a more full conversation with Housing and Community Services and potentially others to really kind of drill down, particularly on the subject of, recovery housing, housing first, harm reduction housing, how we actually, what are we looking for in terms of the proposals, what are the different ways that we want organizations, or we will allow organizations to fund housing services. And we got kind of some umbrellas, but I would really like some specifics.
Thanks, Ron. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Yeah, I was just going to share with Blue that Dharma is planning on coming and doing a presentation on the 30th of this month, and it's going to be on intersexuality and the differences that she encounters as the person she identifies with. And I don't want to even try to explain it any further because I'm not really good with all the verbiage. And so that's why I'm looking forward to her presenting.
Thank you, Sabrina. I see a hand from Lori.
Hi, this is Lori. I'm sorry, I seem to be having a mute problem. I did want to call out one thing, that as you're kind of considering how you want to form the rules around your RFPG and really consider how you might fit the services that you're funding with other services that are already available in OHCS, that I think one thing Mike was alluding to is that they tend to support funding for housing without population-based focus, which is to say without the programming wraparound focus that you might see inside our kind of work and the kind of work that you tend to see in OHA. So as you're forming an RP, you might also want to think about how you segmenting out opportunities based on that kind of work and really highlighting that service and housing flexibility, because I think that is one thing. And the other thing that you're not going to see in their funding at all is anything to do with really any kind of congregate homing or any kind of group, like he was saying, sort of that enhanced shelter and transitional piece. So I do want to make sure that as you're considering how you're forming this, that if you can put vouchers out there, but if there's not homes, or if there's homes and not vouchers, like more kind of looking towards complete programming, for want of a better terminology, because I think that is a piece where you're going to see a different approach that might fit well with these two, but like it'd be a good idea to really think about how you wrap around that person, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Lori. I'm seeing some head nods. Sabrina?
I didn't have anything, Roberta.
Okay. I'm seeing a comment in the chat. Blue, would you like to share?
Sure, I can share. Just that I think it was Mike that presented today, that he was talking about recovery housing and how there's, I don't remember the exact word he used, but that there wasn't like a system of oversight or supervision. And I don't know, like as we move farther along, and I'm thinking like down the road, as we keep putting more funding into that type of housing, is that something that we should address or consider, or is like, I don't have any idea, but I just kind of was throwing it out to the group because I don't know how that works, or if that's something we should try to at least discuss or figure out a system for.
Well, I definitely think it'd be worth a conversation, that's for sure.
And maybe we can have Eric come present on the work they've been trying to do to define. And that's one of the questions I have when I'm in a lot of different spaces talking about supportive housing, recovery housing, like how are you defining that? And so it's so broad. Yeah, I think that's something we should work on and get some insight on how we want to determine. But I think we kind of did some of that when we was talking about diversity of different housing.
Thank you. Yumi, would you like to raise your point from the chat?
Just so I'm taking in everything I'm hearing, and as we're making these rules and we're doing all these considerations, I'm wondering because a lot of you are from the bigger city or the suburbs and stuff like that, and over here where we're in these tiny little rural areas, there's nothing out here, but what we do have some of the same issues as the city. I just am noticing that maybe as we're looking at the rural developments and stuff, we should take into consideration hearing from someone that has experienced stigma or experienced the lack of services and what that's been like from the rural standpoint, as well as the developed area, more developed areas, larger areas. I just, because there's nothing. And we had someone that in our area just purchased a hotel and turned it into a homeless shelter in our area, first one. And it filled up in a day. I mean, and it's so hard. And then they had another hotel that they tried to come in and help and offer low-income housing, but it just was not run correctly and it failed. So, I mean, there's a lot of things I think are, as we go on and develop those rules and things like that, because we have tons of our people, especially in the tribe too, that are transgender and LGBTQI, I believe it is. Sorry, I'm still working on that. But they, and they're in need of places to be and go. And there is, especially in Pendleton, there's a lot of stigma that goes with people that are trying to get help. So that are trying to just be who they are, and so we want to make those changes and stuff. And I don't know if that's just going to be something we want to look at as well.
Thank you, Amy. I'll send it back to Keisha. We can transition to the next speaker, Keisha.
Yes. And was there anything you wanted to say, Roberta?
No, thank you. I'm just here to support you running the show. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to transition to our next speaker, Molly Rogers. I can't 100% remember the organization, but I'm sure she will introduce it. Thank you, Molly.
Good afternoon. Can everyone see me? Great. I had sent a presentation. Ron, are we able to share that? Oh, perfect. That is so wonderful.
Molly, welcome. I also will share that I will monitor the chat along with other folks, so you don't have to track that during your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Roberta. Thank you, chairs. Thank you, committee members, for giving me the opportunity to share with you today. My name is Molly Rogers, and I'm the director of the Department of Youth Services in Wasco County, located in the Dalles, Oregon. And I'm the incoming state president for the Oregon Juvenile Directors Association representing juvenile justice across all 36 counties. I'm here to present today actually about a subcommittee that came up, and so we can switch to the next slide. That came up, and we've been meeting for almost 3 months now with consistently 35 members across the state, including youth. We've been able to be blessed with a youth who's currently a resident of the McLaren Youth Correctional Facility, who's been incredibly instrumental and informative for us on our work that we've been doing. As you all know, Ballot Measure 110, or now Senate Bill 755, which did pass off the floor today, really up until the time we started working on Senate Bill 755, left youth out of the conversation. And it was just silent on youth. And so we needed to be able to kind of explore what the intent was and what the approach should be in working with juveniles and youth who are under the age of 18. So I want to just share some of the people that were included. And in that, advocates, peer mentors, the Oregon Youth Authority, Oregon Judicial Department, district attorneys, law enforcement, juvenile departments, all 35 people. Again, we met weekly for 2 months, and every week everyone came to the table really with wonderful intentions to talk about how to approach youth and how, as we move forward, we increase services and engage with youth. We focused and stayed focused on youth under the age of 18. I know that there's a huge component that needs to look at the population of 18 to 25 as young adults. We really appreciate that, but this particular task force really focused on the under the age of 18. Because again, while Ballot Measure 110 was silent on what that looked like for young people under the age of 18, the changes all impacted both statutes. And for those who may not know, there's a different set of statutes that work for juvenile justice versus adults, specifically around topics such as status offenses. And so really we worked kind of tirelessly on how to bring that to fruition and stay with the intent of Ballot Measure 110, as well as making sure we protect youth. We talked about it from citation, and actually we even talked about it before citation and how we work on prevention, and I'll bring that up a little bit in a few minutes. So the first initial law enforcement contact, all the way through treatment, and then back to reentry, because some youth we know will end up being in a residential or a potentially situation that there's a reentry process. And so the group really talked about all of those. And well, what I really want to share with the OAC at the end of this conversation is this group's committed to staying with you. And I really appreciated a couple of members. Amy, thank you so much. You've been really instrumental of staying with us. And this group shared, I think you heard us say that we want to stick around and potentially be a sounding board for the OAC on youth topics. So if there's a topic that comes up that you just want to vet it through, this group is ready and willing to stand for that to do it. We're going to commit to meeting at a minimum quarterly, potentially monthly. So next slide. Early on in our conversations, we really wanted to talk about what our values as a group were. And so again, you heard the diversity of that group. The values really were trauma-informed services, because youth under the age of 18 may still be experiencing adverse childhood trauma. So when we talk about adults, we talk about their ACE score. For youth, that's a dynamic number because it may still be happening and they may be in the moment of it at that time. The other piece is really developmentally appropriate services along the adolescent continuum. As you can imagine, the adolescent continuum is 12 to 17, 364 days. So that's very different for an appropriate 12-year-old response versus a 17-year-old response. And so we talked about that and where that lies on the system and who are the players. So DHS, Department of Human Services, the Oregon Youth Authority, law enforcement, mental health, Oregon Health Authority, all sorts of different players come in at different points of that. Another thing we really talked about is cultural inclusivity, and this was defined by the youth. And I was so excited to hear your conversation a few minutes ago around race, ethnicity, LGBTQ+, binary, non-binary, transgender. Youth are in the midst of that. Some of it, again, is static by race and ethnicity, and some of it is youth defining who their culture is and who their identity comes up with. And so really being over-inclusive in our cultural response and in our diversity response, being very, very intentional about that so that we really meet youth where they're at. Along with youth come families, and sometimes family is defined again by the youth. It's not necessarily what we always define as a traditional family, but it may be a very non-traditional family, and what that family looks like is defined differently where they're at in the system and how we work with youth. So really looking at bringing the family along to provide services. Removing barriers and avoiding the overwhelming nature of treatment and systems. Making sure that things like transportation and housing are not on the table for barriers. And so again, housing, listening to Mike talk about that, when encouraging us OAC to look at housing as not only just individual, but family. And then finally, meeting youth where they're at and using motivational skills to bring them along. Next slide. This next slide really came from the young man who shared with us from his story from McLaren, is that we need to listen to the youth, acknowledge them, and value them. And so that was something that in the planning process is figuring out how to bring youth to the table. And again, youth may be 18 to 25 and experiencing being able to share what they experienced as an adolescent. We totally appreciate that. Creating screenings within the community so that there's no wrong door, and that wherever screenings happen for adults, have as many screenings for youth, and appropriate screenings. We'll talk about that in a minute. Peers and mentors should be involved. Again, listening to the peer support and the mentors role was really critical to hear. Youth can hear it from somebody who's been there and done that with them, who has their perspective and is a part of that motivation. And then truly, ballot measure 110 for youth, just like they are adults. Senate Bill 755, their services are completely and 100% voluntary. So how do we create a system that we are able to engage with youth? And this we really think about is before they even receive the citation, that we need to bring in the prevention part of it for the youth side from a family perspective, so that we have those supports in place before the first use ever occurs. And this is really around stigma as well, is if they use and if they're caught in this situation, is not being afraid to access services. Then we get to treatment practices. And this is where there's a huge kind of gap in our system for youth. So we want to really maintain that there's a strong focus on reintegration into a youth community, both their peer group, their education supported housing circumstances. I cannot tell you, I've been doing this for 26 years. One of the things I hear over and over again from youth is, when I get back in the community, I find my old friends. So really creating that capacity, the capacity to focus on how youth can reintegrate. I would venture to say that even in urban areas, the peer groups of kids that they come back into is relatively small. All community is small. And so giving them the skills to do that. The other piece is, in our system across Oregon, there are very few best practices for youth substance abuse disorder treatment. There are very few national best practices for youth substance abuse disorder. There are the developmental approach, the adolescent brain, it all kind of gives fits to the traditional adult practices. And so really OAC being innovative and thinking through how we do this, really focusing on creating best practices. There are very few providers within our communities, and I know you guys have talked about this before, but there is a workforce drought for adolescent treatment providers, community-based, residential-based, and figuring out how to build a workforce and being creative in how to build a workforce the committee really talked about that a lot, and we're willing to throw out some ideas there, but that truly is, it's a gap. And that is where we are, we need to figure out this peer support, peer coaching, and how the old model really doesn't work for youth, and because we don't have the providers. There are 4 counties in Oregon that are working on demonstration projects. They're both rural and urban. So I think it's Washington, Clackamas, Malheur, and Wasco are working on partnerships. One of them is with Reclaiming Futures, and it really is around SBIRT and a more motivational interviewing model. But those are relatively new. Some of them have just kicked off within the last couple of months. And so we're excited to look at what those look like and how to take those back into the community. Currently, they're sitting with juvenile justice, and we think that's an appropriate place for them to start. But how do they move then into the school education setting and more of the prevention work? So that is exciting, yet it also feels very much behind the time, like we're trying to play catch up to the starting line. Finally, I just have 2 more slides, I promise. The next one is the adolescent brain. Really encourage OAC as you're kind of working through things to kind of spend some time with the adolescent brain. And that looks that when we go through adolescence, it's literally the change in our brain is as fast as at the time of birth. If you can think back and you hear a song on the radio that were in your teenage years, you can sing every word with it. That's because the brain was changing so fast during that time. What that also means is first use or use of drugs, doesn't matter which type of drug, changes the brain and impacts the brain. So this time of adolescence, especially the young adolescent brain, is really critical for us to think through how we respond to that and how we support them as we're trying to encourage them not to use, to prevent use, or to find treatment. Again, youth are wired to take risks and push the boundaries. That is absolutely what they're supposed to be doing. It's healthy, it's good, but at the same time, it puts them at risk of very, very poor decisions if we don't give them some guardrails to work within. Traditional service models, I've talked about this multiple times, don't work for kids. Just talking at them. I don't know how many of you had adolescents or you can remember your adolescence. When somebody said, "Why did you do that?" and your honest answer was, "I don't know." So that is a piece of it. And then finally, the really cool thing about a kid, about a youth, about an adolescent, about whatever you call them, is they're super resilient. So we know that we can make change and we can engage with them. But the top 3 bullets are true too. So this work group has some recommendations for the OAC that we'd just like to share. One is really, as you guys are looking at your grants and as we're looking at moving forward, is that there's parity for treatment services. We understand, we've looked at the data, youth ballot measure 110 or Senate Bill 755, whatever you want to call them, citations, youth is about 1% right now of the citations. And we realize that it's still a small number, but we feel like it's a really important number. And we also know that there's lots of people intervening with youth at different places than just law enforcement. And so the citation number may not be the truest measure, but really, so just looking at parity and then truly focusing on cultural and geographic equity from the youth's perspective. Requiring elements along the continuum, meaning really talking about whether it's through funding or just your processes, but that there be focus on education, prevention, for youth as they are making choices and doing those risky behaviors. Focusing on community-based services, we all believe that the best services provided in the community, that's more so for youth, I think, than anything. And then ensuring, so residential treatment, there are only 4 residential treatment programs right now in the state of Oregon that accept youth. We lost one as of this upcoming month, so we have another facility close, the YES program in the Corvallis area. And so what happens if we don't have the appropriate residential services for youth is that they tend to default into the juvenile justice system. And we certainly don't want that to happen. And then finally, the reentry support. So just really asking communities to look at that along their continuum as they prepare your grants. Include family-focused treatment for both youth and adults. The other thing we know is lots of families, lots of adults have youth and children. And so making sure that even when we're focusing on the adults, that we don't forget the youth and the children, because they become adults and they potentially come into our system. And then finally, really looking at the community-based initiatives that collaborate across systems, such as treatment, housing, education, co-occurring disorders, family dependency situations, just looking at all of those systems and requiring communities really bring those partners to the table and bring juvenile justice and youth serving to the table, even for the adult systems. That was a fast rundown. I feel like I just really talked at you. So I want to give you some space just to ask me questions on if I missed anything or if you have any interests that I didn't talk about.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I was curious, this last part about parity. Could you talk through how currently youth from 13 to 17, how the treatment is funded? The primary mechanisms for payment?
So the primary mechanism for payment is Medicaid, the Oregon Health Plan. And I think the payment is there. What's not there is the provider network. Does that help, Ron?
Could you say more about that? Because
Yeah.
I understand Medicaid, and what you're saying is we're losing providers, but it's still Medicaid, right?
It is. It's just we're losing providers, and I think that's where maybe the OAC needs to dive in and ask why we're losing providers, because I don't know that we have a good handle. So that's a data piece, and again, maybe that's what you want to throw back to the task force and say, dig in, task force, and give us a written response on what you found and how you found it. I think that'd be totally appropriate, Ron. But yeah, we've lost. Why the residential program in Corvallis closed, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that COVID-19 has transitioned to one of the programs that's located in Prineville is only accepting girls right now. And so, but I do know that's a COVID situation. Residential programs cannot find employees. I know that. That's a across the board happening, is just a lack of filling shifts. But why community-based programs are losing adolescent service providers? I don't know if it's because they don't want to serve youth, because when you serve youth, it's a tough population because you have to serve the unit. I don't know the answer. That would be a great question for us. Yes, Rimrock is the one that is still open, but they are only accepting girls right now. Amy. You're on mute.
Sorry. First, thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful. And I think it helped give us a broader idea of the needs that youth are going to have for consideration as we go forward in making our rules and things, funding, things like that, decisions. So thank you. This is truly a passion of mine. And I think when in one of the meetings that I was in, we talked about the community-based support places for youth and what that might look like for maybe like, a burn center, for youth to go to, their families to go to, support groups, things like that for them, because there aren't any available. There really weren't. And when we talked about it in that meeting, even some of the representatives there were like, what? And I thought, that's sad, because I really feel that what we're doing here with Measure 110 is fully capable of being able to assist what your goals are for the youth in the community as they re-enter, and to prevent them from, hopefully prevent them from entering into the justice system. So I just wanted to mention that.
So I just had a quick question. As we're talking about the youth and the continuum in reentry, we're not just talking about recovery specific, we're talking about like trauma and different aspects of why they might have entered the criminal justice system. Molly, you're on mute.
Oh,
Yeah, you can't talk about just recovery when it's reentry for youth without talking about the trauma piece. They have to go hand in hand because they're still in it. And so yes, that is absolutely accurate. They have to go hand in hand. I saw that there was a piece about family mentors, absolutely peer and family, because families oftentimes don't know what to do and they're asking for help, and giving them a person and a system to be able to reach out to is critically important. So yes, thanks.
Thank you. Blue and then Ron.
I just had a quick question, and I don't know if I'm the only one on the council. I don't understand exactly what reentry means, especially as it relates to youth. And if you could maybe just do a brief explanation of what that is or what it looks like specifically for young people, that would be helpful.
Absolutely, Blue. So it really is about either coming out of a residential treatment program, so reentry to our community after they've had to leave our community for treatment, or leaving our community for some sort of correctional piece. And so very few of our communities have their own either detention center or any kind of residential treatment program in their community. And so it's returning to the community from some sort of placement. Does that help?
A little bit. So is it, are there specific supports that are different from those that would be needed for adults, or I guess I'm just not kind of sure what exactly that would look like.
Sure. So I think it's a couple of things. I really appreciate that. So I think one is family support. So a young person leaves and they're not in the family for a while, and then they come back to the family, which is what we hope. But that there's some dynamics that have changed there. So it really is not just treating the youth or helping support the youth, but it's supporting the family as they do that. And it's also common to adults, I think, as well, but youth coming back into other institutions that may have been judging them or may have been difficult for them to navigate. Schools, returning to an educational setting, supporting a young person walking back into the halls of a school, those kind of pieces. So it really is kind of more holistic to the fact that a young person under the age of 18 still has, if they return before they're 18, they still have rules and barriers and pieces around them that are different than an adult. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, my question was really, it kind of follows along in the same vein, because you've said it a few times that traditional service models don't work for you. So what does work?
Well, so what the belief is, the belief is, and what the Reclaiming Futures and the motivational interviewing is relationships. So youth are a lot about relationships. If you work with young people, it's about respect and understanding them and understanding where they're doing. So the peer support network, the peer recovery mentors and mentors for the family are really, really critical so that youth can find themselves in the story of recovery. And that's really the difference of the prefrontal cortex and the feeling part, the amygdala, is I need to feel that I have a relationship with you when I'm an adolescent versus the adult brain that can say a logical linear model. So it really is, it's slower. You have to accept that it's a couple step forwards and a step back, and that's still forward movement. That's super important, and it's about relationships.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Ron?
No, well, I'm just trying to separate in my mind because it's a couple things because there's a question about parity for residential treatment, and then traditional service models don't work. So I'm trying to reconcile those two things in terms of kind of how we would kind of put that in, how we would operationalize that in our kind of planning going forward.
So maybe I can help a tiny bit. When we're talking about parity, is making sure that it's acknowledged and there's a pathway to it, not parity in the same amount of money, but making sure it's addressed, because we know the numbers are smaller, we know that, but really that it's addressed and yeah, thanks, Ron. That's a great distinction.
Thank you.
Thanks, Blue.
So I just had a question. I know you mentioned peers, and I know we are funding peers. Now, there was a question by Sabrina asking if it would be family mentors to help the youth or peer mentors. And I was just curious as well if there's any sort of specific peers that work with youth, or is this something that the peers we are already funding could also be used to work with youth? I'm not familiar with all of the different types of peers.
Sure. The answer, I think, again, is yes to both of those. So the peers that are currently being focused on, as long as there's training around the adolescent brain, so that peers are not just doing the adult model, especially in the more rural areas. I don't see that there's a dilemma in having that person, as long as there's training around developmental and adolescent brain for peers. I think the family mentor and the peer mentor are both critical in adolescent work, especially for 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, especially for those younger youth. Family mentors are key because parents often and caregivers are often at a loss of what to do. And so family mentors can be, I think those are both things. And yes, we appreciate the focus that the OAC has on peer delivered services.
Thank you, Molly. All right, I'll transition to Keisha. Keisha?
Yes, so we have Tony Vizina here from the Fourth Dimension Recovery Club to talk a little bit about youth services as well. We rushed him to get here, so we're gonna tap in. He's at a conference. So can you hear us, Tony?
Yeah, I'm here.
Molly.
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't have a lot of time to prepare slides or whatever, so I was hoping I could just maybe answer some questions, give you guys some of my history. You know, I'm a person in recovery. I'm coming up on 9 years. Co-founded 4D Recovery. We provide young adult recovery support services. You know, people 18 to 35. We've been doing that for about 7-8 years. The first 3 years of that, we were 14 to 35. And there's a reason that I quit providing services to adolescents, because they need something very specific that I was not able to provide. And it was, in a lot of ways, a really bad practice for what the woman who Molly, I think, before was talking about, which was taking teenagers and applying adult principles of service to them. It didn't work. And one of the things that I noticed was that we were taking really vulnerable kids and pushing them into adult social groups. Like, as Molly said, like, kids are very relational and recovery is relational. And so I noticed that at our center, doing that, we were setting kids up for abuse and to be exploited, and also receive, experience trauma, getting exploited by older men, you know what I mean? Just it wasn't good, and it was setting kids up for failure. And the last thing I wanted to do was facilitate experiences with kids, where their introduction to recovery was to be exploited by an adult. Like, how does that set somebody up for recovery for the future? But at the same time, what I noticed in Oregon is that every single behavioral health provider that served adolescents was ready to send their kids to 4D because nothing existed that was socially based and peer run for young people. And that is the missing link. So what I helped do was organize a group of people, and we launched the first recovery high school. And subsequently, we tried to open up these alternative peer programs. And so, you know, with kids, you know, there's a lot, you know, I can send you guys a best practice manual that I helped create, but there's a lot of stuff. One is just like treating them like adults with respect. One of them is the branding of the agency. How does the agency look? Does it cater to kids? Another one's the staff, you know, does it have peers? Is there a positive peer group for kids to integrate into, right? Because a lot of intrinsic motivation to change for kids, like, comes from their peer group. You can coerce people into stuff, right, as like adults or authority figures, and kids might change based on that coercion. But if you want to internally motivate them for change, it'll be their peer group, right? Entering a peer group that is recovery oriented, that's positive. Like, that's what I've noticed really works. Now, there's some really good models for how to treat adolescent substance use out of Houston, Texas. They're called alternative peer groups. They've been doing it for a long time. Achieving Change Together, Act Northwest. They're an alternative peer group here in Oregon, and they're, you know, doing a good job from what I can see. From Measure 110 standpoint, you could look at programs that wanted to provide adolescent recovery services that would not be included under Medicaid and other funding, and you could fund peers and recovery support services that are not going to be reimbursable. So, you know, stuff like peers to take people out to movies and engage people before they're enrolled in services, and they can be billable, to like outreach and engagement, you know, fund recovery centers, stuff like that. That's not really acceptable under Medicaid. Those are like some of my thoughts. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I wouldn't say I'm like a leading expert in the clinical side of what kids need, the pharmacology of kid, you know, stuff like that. But I'll say, you know, I'm pretty well versed on the social side of it, and also in the importance of having the family included in the therapy, but also having another outlet for the kids to be kids. You know what I mean? Young people need to like be young people still, whether they're using or not. They need to have that social environment to explore who they are, their identity, their sexuality, what they want to be when they grow up, take risks, you know what I mean, become an adult and stuff like that. And what we should be developing is like a system of care where there's transitions between different age groups, right? So like nowhere in Oregon does it exist where like there's a really good adolescent treatment program connected to a recovery high school where there's like a 4D or a Lano club, or, you know, or something there, a Miracles, whatever. And then a collegiate recovery program where if people go to college, they can continue to get support. Like, that doesn't exist. There's those pieces spread out. And it would be really cool if we could get like a complete system anywhere in the state, you know, but we don't. So I'm sorry I wasn't more prepared with slides and stuff. I just didn't have time, and I was presenting at a tribal opioid conference today, and that took up the priority for me. But that, yeah, you know, that's what I got. And then I just want to allow you guys to ask me any questions you want.
Tony, we have a couple questions. We'll start with Ron.
Right, this could be for Tony or for Molly, which is you both kind of touched on the need for protections, and I wanted to just kind of open, you know, kind of hear you out on what kind of protections are in place in terms of these mentor or peer recovery mentor relationships between the families, either for the youth or the young adults. I mean, what are the protections put in place to protect the youth?
Well, there's agency-based protections, and agencies are going to have protocols. You know, any licensed program for behavioral health services, you know, there's going to be, you know, protective considerations in that licensing process. And then there's, you know, the worker protections through the, you know, Unified Code of Ethics for any peers that are certified through MACBO, or any other behavioral health worker certified through MACBO. And so if there's ethics complaints brought against them, you know, MACBO is going to have recourse through investigations and decertifications. Now the community-based stuff, Ron, which was like kind of where I was trapped between that professional and that community, you know, we can refer kids to 12-step meetings, but that is the end of the oversight from a professional standpoint, right? What happens in those communities gets taken care of in the communities. So, you know, one potential protective factor would be very intentional in supporting programs that focused on building youth-based community recovery supports as a way to minimize exploitation by mixing adults with teens, if that makes sense. And then Molly, you know, go ahead and hop in if I missed anything. I'm sorry, I just hopped right in.
No, Tony, I think you're right on. So truly it is around the professional ethics of licensure and agencies and programs. There is a piece that dances between, which is the advocacy groups or local community groups that don't have that level of oversight and licensure. And so it really is making sure that there is a connected adult that has some sort of responsibility, checking in and creating connection with the youth. And that can be a peer that is connected to an agency and is escorting the young person or partnering with them. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that the piece is, Tony hit on it, the youth who are experiencing significant use are at very high risk for exploitation. And unfortunately, there are people out there who will take that opportunity to exploit them. So it really is the licensure piece.
Well, and I've seen, you know, instances where young people will lie about their age as well, because they're just more likely to have high risk behaviors, right? And so they'll lie about their age. And then you have an older person who doesn't know how old somebody is, who engages in a romantic relationship and gets in trouble, you know, for that. And what I saw was a lack of controls set up about aftercare, you know what I mean? Protocols to where it was like, we're not sending young people to young people recovery or communities. We're sending them just to any community, you know what I mean? To some degree, because the lack of infrastructure was there for that. So one thing, Ron, to get to your point, it sounds like your concern is about how the Oversight and Accountability Council creates screening mechanisms to promote safety. You could ask those kind of questions in a grant process, right? Hey, what will you do to ensure safety around young people? How will you ensure safety with community-based events, with peers, blah, blah, blah. You could ask those questions and then grade applicants based on their answer.
Thank you, Tony and Molly. Appreciate that.
Thank you. We have a question from Amy.
Hey, Tony. So I was going back to what you were saying and some of this. So I guess what I want to put out there, would you feel that like you said, in one of the gaps, a youth center, a center where it's based, that helps to get these guys their assessments and things like that with their violations and things like that, a youth center that was set up to be for the young person to transition or to help them, you know, with Alateen or talking circle, activities that involve peers and peer support, as well as, you know, having CRMs that are, you know, certified through MACBO, as well as maybe some ACEs training to help them be aware of the differences that youth are going through and things like that. Do you feel that that could be maintained through the policies, procedures, and some ethics course training that the volunteers or the peers would have that would be interacting in this kind of center? And do you feel that a burn center for youth would be beneficial?
Okay, so I think some of these questions are very nuanced depending on the community that you're talking about. Some communities, they may want to integrate everything. They may want the family to be at the same community center as the kids, so those are things that you have to kind of weed out through the application process. Is how are you going to make your communities or meet your community's needs, right? Whether that's cultural, culturally based or age or whatever, like those are questions you have to ask. I think there is a way for you guys to do your due diligence around safety with young people. The burns, I don't know what that means yet. I've talked to so many people, so I can't answer anything about the burns because I do not know what it means. I can tell you what a recovery center is, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, which I'm going to talk about next week. But I think there's ways to do it. The thing that you have to balance is you have to balance professional services, right? Clinical services, they're the most professional, peer services, right? And then the community, and there has to be linkage there to set people up for success. And you have to make sure that the controls you set up are not so restrictive and prohibited that it excludes cultural practices. Because that's one thing that I see happen a lot is like systems, they just like cannot wrap their mind around shit like sweat lodges and stuff, like some like stuff that are like cultural practices that kind of get excluded from reimbursement or whatever, but they're so essential to helping a community heal or whatever. So having controls that are smart and then grading maybe those on an individual basis, maybe ask people how they're going to create safety and then taking the time to judge each one based on their response instead of having kind of a pre-formatted scale of what needs to happen, if that makes sense. I need to show you an example or something. So I don't think I answered your question fully. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. But you do feel that if there was a center for youth that could do the activities that you were talking about to allow them to be children and see the other side without violence and drugs and all the stuff they've been already exposed to, they could be exposed to camping or exposed to those good things. I think would be beneficial.
Yes, I think, sorry, I turned my video off. So I think that that could be a standalone program, or it could be embedded in another program, just depending on how they had it set up and what the community there wanted and needed. You know what I mean? So, but I think it's important to have young people hang out with other young people and have fun. You know what I mean? And sleep around and go party and go drink 10 Red Bulls and stay out late and run the streets or whatever. Like those are things that young people do. There's no way to stop it, but it's like, how do we minimize the damage and make sure that when young people make sure they can identify problem recognition. If they need to be in recovery, they can, and make sure that they feel safe and comfortable doing that by being their friend and you know what I mean, and meeting them where they're at and talking to them like a real person and an adult, you know what I mean, and allowing them to make mistakes, because young people, they have a different brain structure. It's not fully developed yet, so they're more amped to make really risky decisions.
So, cool, Tony, thank you.
Thank you. Molly, would you like to speak to that?
Well, so yes, I think Tony, I agree with Tony on lots of the pieces of it. And Amy, I've heard you talk about this before, which is every community is different, rural versus urban. And so it may look different. In a rural area, it may look as a center as a point in time location, where a more urban or populated area may be a center. I think the key pieces that I really appreciate from Tony on is that it needs to be safe from the youth's perspective. And so they bring the safety to the space, and the adults just kind of have the soft edges for them. The other is that that it really truly is around developmental and motivating from where they're at that moment in time. And so when we try to do really prescriptive things with adolescents, sometimes they go sideways really fast because that's not where they're at that day and they need something else that day. So yes, I think a safe space and how that's defined, each community, I think the OAC needs to ask any applicant or any community to give them the data on why that is the definition and for their safe space in their community. And again, I think it will be different in different parts of Portland. I think it will look different than it would. But I think that is the piece is the kids get to define their definition of safety.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you. There was a comment from Eowyn, a council member in the chat. I'd like to share with you speakers. Eowyn was saying, thanks, Tony. I agree that recovery programs can make a big difference, even for reimbursable services. There's often a big initial investment to get the services up and running before they can receive payment.
It looked like Karen had something too.
Yeah,
Karen, would you like
yeah.
Thanks.
I know that, you know, it's really sad to hear that there's another adolescent residential program closing down. I did hear about that before. It's really hard to make these programs work and to function. They have to have a lot of staff. They have to keep boys and girls separated, and of course they also have the added responsibility of making sure that all the youth get education. So they have to partner closely with schools. So it's really not an easy task. But what I was thinking about is there's some really good models on the mental health side. One of them is called ESA, Early Assessment and Support Alliance. And that is really built on a peer model. So a youth, for instance, who has a first psychotic break or episode gets involved in ESA, and they get attached to a peer right away. And like I know in Lane County, I'm more familiar with Lane County's ESA because I've toured it, I've talked to the staff and seen it. But they have a center, a youth center there. They've got this big old flat screen TV, and it's hooked up to all the kind of games that you could possibly think of. There's a cabinet full of like shampoo and conditioners and anything you can think of there as well. And it's just kind of it's a really nice way for youth to get involved and to experience other people who've gone through this, who've made it through, and start healing their brain right away, because that's super important. I think that's also super important for youth that get involved in using substances. So that's just one thought that was kind of rolling through my mind. And then another model that's really effective is in the peer space, but it's really family navigators. So these are parents who work with other parents who are really struggling because they have youth with mental health conditions. And that happens also for parents, obviously, who have youth that get involved in using substances. I've had calls myself, both at the state and with my current job, where youth parents are just at their wits' end. They don't know what to do. They're super scared. They're afraid. Their youth might have run away. They have run away in the past. They're afraid they're going to do it again. They're afraid they're going to be arrested or worse, OD, or get exploited by an adult, like we were talking about earlier. And these parents, there's a really effective way that Oregon Family Support Network has approached the training for the parents and the support for the parents. And it might be worth talking to them as well. And then there's another group that I just thought of on the mental health side too, but Youth Era. They are doing some fantastic things. Actually, this is international now. Martin Rafferty. They're doing a lot with social media. They also have drop-in centers for youth, and it would be really great to get some of the stuff replicated for youth who have substance use issues. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Amy, do you have a hand up?
I didn't think I did, but Karen, that was great. And if you could send in the chat the name of that place that you just mentioned, again, that would be great, so I could write that down. My brain was going too fast, I couldn't type it. And could someone give Tony the example of what the burn is as compared to, as alternative to what we were talking about, the ARCs? Please.
I think it's the same thing, just the name change.
So it's a addiction recovery center. It's basically what the burn is. And I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head why we changed the name. But I think because it has some behavioral health side to it as well. But I think it's more just a recovery center.
Yeah, and then it was just some people felt like it kind of alluded to it had to be brick and mortar,
right?
And not like a network. It had to be like a physical location, or I don't remember all the things.
Oh,
I love
it. Keisha. Yeah, I know, right? I couldn't remember either. I was like, oh.
I'll go ahead and call on Blue. Blue, would you like to speak to that?
From my understanding, it did shift a little bit between being a brick and mortar, and now it's more looked at as a network of organizations that work to provide the services. So one organization wouldn't have to provide all the different types of services like harm reduction, treatment, peer support. And there can be organizations that are within a network that don't get Measure 110 funding, from my understanding, as long as they're all working to sort of do the work and provide those services. The one thing that I think we're going to discuss maybe at another council meeting is the 24/7 phone triage line. Initially it was thought people could like walk into a physical place 24/7, and that's not realistic. And so we do have a triage phone line, and I think it's going to be discussed whether or not the phone line, which we have one for the whole state right now, whether or not that stays, or if that's going to be something that some of these networks have in each county.
No, thanks for that. Yeah. I mean, it seems a little nebulous to me, the whole thing, and I feel like there's a way to achieve the goal of the ARCs or the burns in a way where you guys wouldn't have to spend any of your money, and you could focus on other things besides like an agency coming to be like, I'm going to do this burn, and we're going to have all these staff, it's going to cost all this money. Where like a lot of that stuff is already there. The infrastructure is already there to process those calls. It would just be like the state requiring the counties to do it, or something like that. And anyways, I have a lot of thoughts about it. I've thought about it a lot, but that's not today. If you guys ever want to talk about it, let me know. I have lots of ideas. But anyway, so anything else on like the youth side? Let me just say that Oregon sucks at it. It's horrible. It's like I got into this work wanting to help young people, years ago. And what I saw in general, but especially with teenagers and young people, was grotesque. It was demonstrable. It's like horrible. People have to send their kids to other states. You know what I mean? To get care because it doesn't exist. And I would say now the infrastructure is starting to be developed, and I would encourage you guys to look into like alternative peer groups, recovery high schools, stuff like that, and think about how you might help some of those efforts. In the future, I could hook you up with the person who runs the recovery high school. She's a friend of mine. and somebody who runs an alternative peer group, and maybe you could have them come present on their model. They kind of work together to get a better idea of what some of these alternative, like non-Oregon traditional models could look like. That's up to you guys. I'm just, grateful to be here and honored to help any way that I can.
Thank you, Tony. You have a lot of great knowledge, and that's why I was really glad to hear that you were going to be sharing with us today. I really admire how far you've come and what you do for your community. So I'm still going to be bugging you to come out here to the rural areas.
All right, Karen, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll help you out, Tony, too, if you want to come out to the Eastern Oregon side. Just let me know. I think the Recovery High School concept is actually really phenomenal, and it would be excellent to be able to support that and to watch that grow throughout Oregon. And I know it's not people under 18, but I would just mention that Southern Oregon University has a recovery college within the college too.
Right,
So,
it's like we need to get all of those pieces, like the ecosystem, together somewhere. It's really fragmented, and and I'm hoping that the assessment or inventory or whatever OHSU is doing right now to give us the landscape is going to give everybody a better idea of how we start filling the actual gaps. And Karen's, and if you guys didn't know, like Karen's like one of the, what I would say is the goats around peer services and stuff. I read a report that she wrote like years ago, and it was very good. So I'm glad to see you here, and I'm always happy to come out there.
we'd love to have you. And I know you've been involved with Oregon Recovers too. And I just say, Oregon Recovers did a series of focus groups in Eastern Oregon, and I have that report too if anybody's interested, but really phenomenal feedback about the recovery system in Eastern Oregon that they did for us.
And I was just wondering, I just want to hop in real fast as we're talking about youth and adolescents and different interventions, if maybe like funding, whether they go to like basketball camp or football camp or, different things like that. Even fishing trips, depending on, the kid and the environment they're in too. And looking at if they have to go back into some of these hostile environments where everybody's smoking weed and drinking, like how different ways to address things like that. And the generational trauma, like 3 generations of incarceration and things like that. But like alternative ways to fund some of these things that are not evidence-based and are just cultural barriers and challenges.
No, and I think, you bring up a good point that I've been trying to wrestle with, and that's like, how do you do like some of this integrated work? And I'm not even like talking about like addiction treatment, mental health treatment. I'm talking about like prevention, intervention, and then people engage in recovery, right? Like where's the after school programs to help kids, and then where's the intersection between the after school program that's there to help prevent kids from getting a substance use disorder, or potentially help them maintain their remission, but also like where's the intersection of that at the school where there's a recovery mentor or somebody who's there, who can help connect with someone and help them identify their problem. And then where do they go where it's like cool to be in recovery? You know what I mean? Where it's like cool. Like it ain't about like compliance and coercion. It's like, hey man, life is better over here. We're having fun. We're buying cars. We're doing, you know what I mean? Like life's good. Come hang out with us. You know what I mean? Where's that at, in all of it? And, hopefully my vision, for Oregon is a more collaborative, integrated system, that's where that is promoted, almost mandated through funding mechanisms that force people to work together versus what I see, which is a really politicized system insofar that to get funding, you have to go like to each little pot of money and get funding for your organization, but there isn't a lot of collaboration. And that's a whole probably conversation for a different day. But like for you guys, like how can you be innovative in accepting proposals or requiring proposals that force people to work together? Maybe I don't know if that's something you could consider, like, hey, we want multiple organizations to apply for one contract. We're going to do like A, B, and C. I'm not saying that's what you should do, but those are some things you may consider that help create integration between, thinking about young people, like going to a treatment center and then going to recovery high school. And then maybe there's like integration into a 4D or something like that. Like, how do you mandate collaboration between those three entities, which we know is going to benefit the consumer, but having those three pieces just there doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be, intentional collaboration that really benefit people to move them through their life or their continuum of care, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making sense to you guys.
You made sense, Tony. That was kind of a battle we had, whether we require people to collaborate and work together. That's where the burns came in, or if they just have a piece of some of the services that could be included in the burn. Yeah, that's been a.
And it ended up being in the law, Senate Bill 755, where the council has a way of encouraging collaboration among various entities in the burn. It's in the law.
Yeah, this is Molly, and I would even go up a little bit farther, and I really appreciate that. But that's where we support young families or families who have young children who are finding themselves in the citation piece, is supporting the younger children with housing, with trauma-informed services, and really looking at. So I'm going to take it beyond my young adults, adolescent, and move back to the children. I really appreciate that, Lakeisha. And I also, Tony, I think it truly is around collaboration. And I was really appreciative of the language in 755, because just sending out money to programs just sends out money to programs. I really appreciate that comment on working together. And that is how adolescents need to have the system support them, is by us coming together. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I want to get to Caroline's hand. Caroline?
Sorry, I'm running between two computers here. So, I think Karen will agree with me on this. We did have a pretty, I think, good system in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Molly's agreeing too. And we wanted to make sure that the Institute of Medicine was looked at from prevention to treatment to aftercare, and looking at mental health as a foundation and even physical health as that foundation, and none of it needs to be left out. We also promoted from prenatal all the way to elder or seniors. And the fact that there was a time, probably in the 90s, where we had sign off from a variety of all the funders, and the Senate bill, it used to be 555 when we had the Commission on Children, and I think there was another word to it, and where they took the lead in making sure that there was an actual comprehensive plan. Now, what happened in the mid, like around 2015, everything was dismantled. And I cannot believe how far reversed that we went in a matter of 5 to 6 years. And we need to get back to that, Tony, in terms of the state plan itself. We tried to get a little bit there. I think we had more support in terms of making sure that prevention was included. However, with measure, 110, all of us are using the prevention language a little bit differently. And a lot of folks was looking at even harm reduction as being preventative. It might be preventative, but it's not really the science in terms of what prevention was based on. And so I'm in total agreement that we need to bring everything together. Now, the tribes are going to have an advantage because we advocated and we pushed. And I think, and I'm not even sure if I could even announce this yet, but we are going to be pulling out the funds from public health and returning it back to the health systems for the tribes. I really want that for all the counties. It's not because I don't agree with the public health approach, but for substance use disorder, the public health approach only deals with environmental and policy issues. Most of the main focus is on trying to increase taxation, which does work to a degree. But the prevention that we used to do at the state was a comprehensive approach, where if you look at the certification process for our prevention specialists, you'll be overwhelmed in terms of what they have to master. And until we go back to a comprehensive approach and where all the players come together within the counties or within the tribe, we're going to continue to just do, it's like protecting our little area and not working together. Unless we're mandated to work together, we're not going to move forward. And our statistics in the 90s was really overwhelming, and we really showed some really good outcomes. But around 2005, 2010, as the changes happened within the state, it started when we split from DHS to Oregon Health Authority, and now we're trying to find a way to work with DHS. I mean, just totally ridiculous that we continue to do the same thing and expect different results is the definition of insanity. So we're going to have that ability with the tribes, but I really want the host state to come on board. But our argument only impacted the tribes. So like I said, I'm not sure if it's official, but we already got Pat Allen's okay to hopefully move those funds over so we could actually use our tribal strategic behavioral plan to start moving forward. But I want that for the whole state.
I defer to you when it comes to prevention in South Carolina and all your expertise and everything. So thanks.
Thank you.
Molly does have to take off. So I just wanted to say thank you, Molly, for being.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Molly. Good to see you again.
Yeah, nice meeting you, Molly.
Go ahead, Keisha.
Well, if there's no more comments or questions from the audience or our tri-chairs. And also, I just had this on my mind real fast. I wanted to recognize that, in the state of Oregon, now Juneteenth is considered a state holiday. But within that still, dominant culture folks are still benefiting off the blood, sweat, and tears of African Americans and enslaved folks. So if you find in your heart and mind, if you are non-African American, to do something nice for, because a lot of people are getting paid holidays off, do something nice for a neighbor, a friend, somebody in the community, maybe a nice act of kindness. Yeah, would be well appreciated. And if there's nothing else from the tri-chairs, we have a few minutes left. We might end early, but anything from our tri-chairs?
No, we're good. Great conversation. Thank you.
We have a couple hands up and we have some time. Let's go to Caroline, and Blue. Go ahead, Karen.
I have more of a procedural question, and I've been asked by one of my constituents in Eastern Oregon how the council is getting either questions or comments from people that are not in the council. And since I haven't heard us do like a call for public comments or anything at the end, I don't think we've talked about that. So I just wanted to put that out there. We don't need an answer today, but that was a question that came to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Caroline?
No, I just didn't put my hand down. So I don't have anything else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Blue, go ahead.
I just wanted to check in because I think after the first round of the RFGPs, there was room for feedback for the future RFGPs, which I believe there was a deadline of June 30th. which came from Coral, and I just wanted to check in and see if that was still a deadline, and I didn't know if there were going to be any if we were going to discuss that as a council or discuss that in some sort of other meeting that would be at a different day and time. I know I've sent some feedback on that, but I'm also just curious about that, as well as if we could at some point discuss the separation of the 24/7 triage line from the burn, because the way the language was in 755, they are connected, and a burn was required in every county according to the language that passed in the Senate. So I don't know if Wes, if you have anything on that.
So let me take Karen and Blue's questions in order, if that's okay with you, Blue. So Karen, you're absolutely right. So we do have a mailbox for public comments. It's posted on the Measure 110 OAC website. We'll start making an announcement, and I'll work with Roberta to make sure that we have that at the beginning of our live YouTube event, so people know to use it. We receive things every once in a while, and we pass that along to the tri-chairs. I just want to make sure that folks that are watching and that you know as well, Karen, that we have that available. Blue, with respect to deadline, I think we're thinking about two different things. So the information that you're providing back on the RFGP is being worked into the conversation about rules and what we're going to do moving forward. So there's no hard deadline for that. I think money getting out the door was the deadline of June 30th. So that RFGP process that we all went through earlier a month ago, that's wrapping up, and we're trying to get money out the door now. But with respect to providing input and thinking about future funding opportunities, that's all being captured as part of the rules. And then we're also capturing that information as you all develop new RFGPs or new funding sources, taking yours and others' feedback and making sure that is available. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I did think I thought I saw an email saying that feedback did have that same deadline, but I'll double check that. I just wasn't sure, again, if we were going to discuss it all together or, just having side conversations. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you all. So now we're at time, overtime. If you want to respect
we are at time, but one of our guests, Tony, has a hand up. Can we go to him really quick?
Yeah, just really quick. I think, I talked to Keisha, and I was going to come present with some of my coalition members next week about recovery community organizations. And I just wanted to know how long we had and what.
We had talked to you about that offline.
Okay, bye. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Later, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank
you, Tony.
Yeah.
Take care. Enjoy your new office, Amy.
Is that it? We're done? Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.